It's a pleasure to introduce Larry Anovitz, a colleague of mine from Oak Ridge National Labs. And I will do a brief little bio here. Correct me if I get anything wrong. So Larry got his bachelor's in geology from University of Arizona in 1980, and then did a master's at Michigan, and then continued on and did a PhD at Michigan with Eric Esseen, who I think many of you knew, where he worked on metamorphism in the Greenville belt. So, what?
Grenville.
Oh, Grenville. I'm sorry. I mispronounced that. So he was working at higher pressure temperature conditions, and then actually moved to lower temperature conditions as he continued in his career. Right after that, he was a professor for several years back at University of Arizona. And then in 1994, he moved to his current position where he's a senior scientist at Oak Ridge National Labs and has a faculty position at University of Tennessee as well. So he's been at both places for many years now. Larry is working now on reactive transport through porous materials and all kinds of mineral fluid interactions and equilibria and so forth. He's won many awards. He was an NSF graduate fellow at University of Michigan. Also got a pre-doctoral fellowship there. He's won a Presidential Young Investigator Award, and in 2007 was elected a fellow of the Mineralogical Society of America. So we're glad he could come over. He's doing some experimental work at NIST right now, and agreed to come over and visit us and give a talk. So I will let Larry take it away on evolution of porosity and pore fluids and pore scales.
Well, thank everybody for coming here. Let me get this. I usually talk loud enough to be heard, but just in case, we'll use the official extrapolator here. All right, can everybody hear me for sure now? Okay, good. First, before I start, I just want to wish Dan good luck in his new job. 3 weeks before you head off. Huh? All right, you'll do great. So what I want to talk to you about today is work we've been doing for several years now, and looking at the evolution of porosity and pore-confined fluids in a range of different geological environments. And before I get started on that, obviously this is not something I have done alone. I've got a huge number of collaborators and colleagues working on this, and chances are I've forgotten at least a couple on this list. Okay, now, this is, I assume, mostly a group of geologists, and we're all familiar with the general idea of what a pore is. We tend to define it here as simply an open space at some scale in a rock material. And because geology is, as varied as it is, when you start talking about porosity in rocks, you have to consider things over a huge number of scales. At the finest scale, you've got things. This is the structure of beryl, which we'll talk about a little later, which has channels in it that are nominally about 5 angstroms across. And at the upper scales, if you think about something like a cave as just a very large pore, open space in a rock, then you've got things that are many meters across, even kilometers. So you've got maybe 10 orders of magnitude here that you have to work with. Most of what I'll be talking about are things that go from the atomic scale up to something like the centimeter scale, at least in this talk. Now, before I get started on this, because this is something I think that fewer people in geology are aware of, I just want to tell you a little bit about how we use various types of neutron spectroscopy and scattering to look at these kinds of problems. Now, by saying this, and most of what I'm going to show you today is neutron data, I don't mean to imply that we don't use X-ray things as well. They tend to be very complementary, but it's rather newer in geology to apply neutron techniques to understanding these problems. I'm sure you're mostly very aware of the kinds of things you can do with X-rays. Neutrons, however, have several properties that make them rather unique. The first is that, whoops, went the wrong button, is that because a neutron has a spin, you can actually use it to directly interrogate the magnetic properties of materials. And some of the things we've been working on, for instance, are the magnetic spin waves in dioptase recently. More important for what I'm going to be talking about here, however, is that neutrons tend to be high because they don't have a charge. They don't really interact with the electron cloud in an atom very much. They primarily interact with the nucleus through the strong force. And because of that, they tend to be highly penetrating materials. You don't need nearly as much energy for a neutron to go through whatever you're looking at. And they are dependent on not just on the isotopic properties of the nucleus, not just the average atomic number. So you can use that, for instance, to actually do things like contrast matching to give you a way to look at, for instance, the connected porosity versus unconnected porosity. The other thing is that if you look here, this is the X-ray cross-section, and it does exactly what you'd expect. As you get to heavier and heavier elements, you get more and more scattering from an X-ray. That does not occur for neutrons. And most importantly, for many of the things we do, the scattering cross-section for hydrogen is very large. So neutrons are a way that you can rather easily look at anything with hydrogen in it. Okay. There are a number of different types of techniques for using this, which include both elastic and inelastic types of scattering, as well as imaging. Now today what I want to talk to you about, I'm going to use several of these to kind of split this talk into three parts. And the part of the goal here is that if I run out of time, I can drop the last part and we can talk about that later. We're going to first talk about the evolution of multi-scale porosity in shales and sandstones. And this is primarily experiments that are done using small and ultra-small angle neutron scattering. Then we're going to look at the properties of ultra-confined fluids. That is, in this case, we'll be primarily looking at water in the channels and barrels. So we can go from looking at the nature of the pores themselves to the nature of pore-confined fluids. Mostly this will involve inelastic neutron scattering. And finally, if we have time, I'll look at we'll take this from a semi-static mode to a non-static mode and look at flow in porous and fractured media, which is something we can do rather nicely using various types of neutron imaging. Okay, so we'll begin by looking at a little bit about what we can tell about porosity in these kinds of rocks. Now, we didn't want to spend a whole lot of time showing you this is a neutron small angle spectrometer, this is how it works. Think of it essentially just like the X-ray diffraction instrument in your laboratory, except that you're looking at much smaller scales. Effectively, what you're looking at is diffraction from non-ordered materials. What you're looking at scales here, I mean, typically the scales, for diffraction would be out in here. This is Q is the momentum transfer in 1 over angstrom, 1 over distance. It's essentially equivalent to 2 theta. 2 theta increases to the left here as well. Right, so here we're talking about scale as opposed to intensity, and this is typically the kind of curve that you'll get from scattering from a rock material. There aren't any particular peaks in it because there's nothing ordered in the porosity of the material, but it's a diffraction pattern nonetheless. From it, you can measure such things as the total porosity, which is related to the area under the curve. You'll often see surface fractal type behavior, so you can look at the roughness characteristics of surfaces at smaller scales. In some rock materials, you also will see an ordering mass fractal type behavior of the pores themselves. Some rocks show this, some do not. Small angle scattering, typically you'll get up to scales maybe 30 microns, small and ultra small angle scattering. Small angle scattering goes to about 0.3 microns, ultra small will take you out to maybe 30. You can also extend that by using standard imaging, because if you take the 2-point autocorrelation, which I can explain to somebody if they want to know how it works, and you take the Fourier transform of that, it's the scattering curve. So that by adding small angle scattering, ultra small angle scattering, and imaging, we can cover scales then from about a nanometer on the small size up to something on the order of a centimeter if we're using, say, an SEM or an X-ray CT to do the imaging on the larger size. About 7 of those orders of magnitude I was talking about. Now, the first thing I want to do is look a little bit at some gas shales from South Texas. These are samples from the Eagleford Shale, and this is a satellite image taken a few years ago this is the Eagleford right here. That's all gas drill wells. It shows you just how much drilling was going on in this area a few years ago. Obviously, it's dropped off a little now, but there is a huge amount of potential here. It tends to go from oil here to wet gas to dry gas as you move to the southeast. And we obtained a series of samples here from drill cores from a friend at Chesapeake Oil that are in here that cross from, from low maturity to high maturity samples. And the question was, what's happening to the porosity of these rocks? Because obviously we want to know how it is that the oil and gas that's present there is able to make its way out of the sample. How's it stored? How does it come out? Depths here were from about 5,500 to 8,800 feet. Now this is what a scattering pattern looks like on a small angle scattering instrument. Okay, it just shows scattering intensity as a function, which is given as the color, and scattering angle is just out from the center. And what you tend to do is the detector here is usually about 15 meters long, and you simply move the detector to different positions, covering a large range of Q and therefore a large range of scales. If you look here, though, you'll see that the sample on the left is highly anisotropic, whereas the one on the right is not. What happens is if you take that shale and you cut it parallel to bedding, you'll get this type of isotropic scattering. If you cut it perpendicular, you see significant anisotropy in the porosity in the rock. The problem becomes how do you treat that since it's directional. And so what you end up doing is analyzing this as a sector. Normally with something like the one on the right, you can just radially average it. But in order to handle anisotropic materials like this is the lower grade shale that we were looking at. You actually have to look at this in a directional manner. And that will give us some, as you'll see in a moment, some interesting insights into what's happening. This shows the scattering patterns integrated for those samples. And what you see, this is carbonate-rich samples on the left, clay-rich samples on the right, and increasing maturity as you go down. Now, this doesn't look like the scattering pattern I showed you before, and the reason for that is that we've plotted not intensity here, but Q to the 4th times intensity. And all that does is it takes a scattering pattern that has a -4 slope and rotates it to flat. And the reason for that is that you tend to hide a lot of detail in that long log-log plot. And so by doing this, we're able to blow up the scale and see what differences are occurring. So what you see then is as you see well, this here is background. Let's start with that. What you see here is at smaller scales, we see a surface fractal type scattering. These are rough materials. But there's a limit to that scale. And above that, we get scattering, a mass fractal scattering that is telling us about the relationship between the pores in the samples. Now, I'm not sure if I have to tell this group much about fractals, and in this case for the shales, I'll go into it more with the sandstones. But essentially, a surface fractal is a measure of the roughness of the material. Mass fractal gives you a measure of how those pores are ordered within it. And we can talk more later about actually how that's defined. But what you see in these samples is that these are done along bedding and across bedding, the same two things I just showed you. And you can see that with maturity, both for carbonate-rich and clay-rich materials, that difference disappears. That is, at low maturity, these samples are highly anisotropic in the distribution of their pores. As maturity increases, that anisotropy, which you would kind of expect to see in a shale, disappears. At all scales, in this case up to about 30 microns. Now we can take this and actually use it to calculate the pore volume distributions. We've changed the orientation here slightly. This is carbonate-rich at the top. This is clay-rich at the bottom. But you can see two things here. First, look at the scale difference here. We've lost the anisotropy. We've lost much of the porosity in total, and all of the small-scale porosity, or almost all of it, has disappeared. So we can see what's happening it hasn't completely gone away in the clay-rich, and that's not surprising because that's probably scattering between the clay particles themselves. But we can see that maturity is dramatically influencing the properties of the porosity in these shales. As we get to higher and higher maturity, we get to much more isotropic materials and much less porous materials. So the fracture patterns that would be expected if you go in and model a fracturing of a shale from, say, hydrofracking will be significantly different if you try to do this for low versus high maturity materials. You really need to include this kind of work in trying to understand how those materials fracture. Now, as a summary of shales, I'm going to try to go through a number of things here. We can see that, as I just said, the porosity is initially highly anisotropic, which is probably expected for a shale, but that decreases with maturity. Total porosity decreases, and the smaller pores seem to fill and disappear first in these shales. I'm going to compare that now and see what happens in a sandstone. Sandstones we're going to be looking at came from a series of drill cores in the Illinois and Michigan basins, part of the CO2 sequestration work that they were doing here a few years ago. So we've got 4 different samples from the Illinois basins. These are all in the St. Peter sandstone. One sample from the Michigan basin, which is our deepest sample, down to about 10,000 feet. And we also have a series of samples. These were originally collected by John Valley at Wisconsin, from southwest Wisconsin, where the St. Peter has really never been at depths. It's always been near the surface. And so the changes that are observed in the sandstone here occurred due to siltcrete precipitation, not due to burial diagenesis. Yep, wrong one again. Okay, so if we look at those basinal samples, we see a number of changes that occur in these materials. This is the shallowest one. You can see that there's an awful lot of just grain-grain contacts, a lot of open porosity, little bit of calcite present in this, but not too much. But as we go deeper and deeper in those samples, the image scale porosity, as we kind of expect as we're compacting the sandstone, is disappearing. Also, it's filling in. The quartz here is filling in the spaces between these larger grains. Still is not much, the carbonate here is the slightly brighter stuff. That's not what's forming cement in these rocks. Now this again shows the scattering patterns for several of, these are just, we actually looked at something like 30 samples. These are just the ones that have the highest porosity at each depth. And we can see a distinct pattern in these. Again, remember, as you go to the left, 2 increases, you're going to larger and larger scales, just like in a typical diffraction pattern. So at the largest scales, what we see is that the porosity is decreasing as we get deeper. That's completely wrong. This is the shallowest samples, these are the deepest samples. Whereas as we get to the smaller samples, while it's not completely clear, you can see again, as you get deeper, you seem to get larger amounts of small porosity scattering. Larger numbers, in that case, of small pores. Now, we can take those data and we can actually calculate what the pore distribution for these samples looks like. There's a number of ways to do this, and there are a number of assumptions in it. So I wanted to show you a little bit about how much to trust that kind of a calculation. What you see here is the same calculation on the same sample, assuming that it's a highly prolate, a sphere, or a somewhat oblate spheroid. And you can see that what it tends to do as you make things more and more oblate is smear out these pore distributions. However, the same basic pattern occurs. The porosity in sandstone is not a continuous distribution. Remember the one that we saw for the shales, kind of a large lump, maybe something at smaller scales. However, for the sandstones, what we tend to get is a series of log normal distributions in these materials. They are not continuous. Now, the origin of that still remains somewhat uncertain, but one possible origin for it comes from the idea of a fractal construction called an Apollonian gasket. Just consider a series of spheres, or a series of circles in 2 dimensions, that are each touching one another. And then put one circle into the space between the 3. That leaves 3 more spaces between them, which are of similar sizes. If you fill those with the next size of a grain, you'll get a gap in spacing between those pores. So what you should expect, now of course, real sandstones aren't spheres, right? The sand grains aren't spheres. But it says that you should expect, if you have packing where smaller grains are filling in with larger ones, that you should expect the porosity to be not continuous. but to occur in a series of distributions. And it turns out, it was actually suggested long ago by work on sandstones just by sieving them, that sand grain distributions were log normal. And essentially that's what we seem to see here, is a series of log normal distributions, somewhat smeared out, and we can't exactly tell the difference between those. Now, if we plot the porosity as a function of depth, this is, on the left, shows the porosity simply from imaging. So this is SEM imaging. And essentially it shows what you'd expect. As you get deeper and deeper into the sample, the overall total porosity decreases as the material gets more and more compacted. That should be expected. However, if we add in then the data from the small angle scattering so that we can look at what porosity is doing at finer scales, we can see essentially what I showed you in that scattering pattern before. While the larger size pores are becoming a smaller percentage of the total porosity, the finer ones are growing. Now, in part, this may be because you are compacting large pores into small ones, right? As you compact the sample, you're going to be reducing that size. Now, this kind of thing has been observed before. J. Ag, Simon Emanuel have looked at this in sandstones. They've looked at this in salt. Well, they also found that in those kinds of materials, it was the larger pores within the samples that filled first. Remember the shales? It was the opposite way. The small pores were filling first. There's two other, this is an uncertain question. There's two other possible reasons for this. The first is, and I'm going to mention this briefly in a little bit, as you get fluids into smaller pores, the properties of those fluids change because of the interaction of the fluid with the material that makes up the grain boundaries. So it's been suggested, and this was by J. Ag and Simon Emanuel, that actually because of that, the solubility of, say, quartz is larger in water in a confined pore than it is in a larger pore, and so it is less likely to precipitate there. That's actually the opposite of what's been suggested by an icing model by Hedges and Whittle. The other possibility, however, is that this may reflect flow paths through the sample. In order to get something to precipitate, you've got to get the material to the pore space. So it may be that in a sandstone, the larger pores are filling first because this is primarily a transport-driven process. Whereas in the sandstone, in the shales with maturity, and so we've also seen this in metamorphic samples, it may be more of a reaction precipitation process. So the change may have to do with the process as much as with the transport within the rock. Okay. The same thing, interestingly, was seen in the St. Peter sandstone at the materials that were at the surface. The smaller pores, again, were what filled first. So this one has nothing to do with compaction. This is simply precipitation. That's a silkrete formation. Same thing happened. We got the smaller pores filling up first. The wrong button there. Now remember I mentioned earlier that we can also measure from the slopes of the scattering curves what the fractal dimensions are for these materials. We can get that as well from the images. We can calculate the fractal dimensions and what is called the multifractal dimensions, which is how fractal dimension scales as a function of size. And we've seen for both types of sandstones that we've looked at the same result. At the image scales, this is percent porosity. So as the thing is compacting, you're moving to the left. That's deeper to your left on this one. And you can see that the overall or average fractal dimension, that's it's D0 in the multifractal thing, but it's an average non-scale dependent fractal dimension, tends to get smaller. That means things are getting smoother as we are getting, as we're making things deeper at the image scales. However, they're also becoming more multifractal. That is, the dependence on scale of the fractal dimension is increasing. And in fact, if we look at the fractal dimension that we calculate from the scattering curves, so now with the images we're looking at scales that are, say, a micron or greater, and ballpark we're mostly looking at scales that are a micron or smaller. With the scattering, the opposite happens. Now again, this is backwards, so depth is increasing to the right here. You can see that what's happening is that the fractal dimension is increasing. It's been suggested before for metallurgical reactions that what happens as you heat these kinds of materials is that you transfer entropy from one scale to the next. In other words, things at the larger scales become smoother, but things at finer scales become rougher. And that's exactly what we've observed here in the sandstones. Now, again, the origin of this is, at the moment, uncertain, but we've seen it now in several different sandstone applications. We can also calculate the surface area to volume ratio. This is really important if you want to understand reactive transport, because you need to know how much of that surface is present and accessible, and how much is there to begin with. Now I've done this by combining the two data sets that you've just seen. You can take that distribution of porosity and you can calculate a surface area and a volume for that. That assumes all these smooth spheroids. So that gives you what in this equation is given as surface area over volume naught. For a given size, it gives you this smooth surface area. And from the fractal scattering, we can calculate this total ratio. This is D0 is a ruler length. R is actually the correlation length in the sandstone. And by combining those two, then, we can calculate the surface area to volume ratio for that sample as a function of depth. And you can see that what happens now at the highest scales, at the least depth, this is the surface stuff, these have the overgrowths growing on them. So this is altered material. That's the material with the least amount of overgrowth. So if we want to see what's happening with depth, we put this here, but this is really what the pattern is. You can see that in general, surface area to volume ratio is decreasing in these samples. So we're getting less reactivity, less ability for reaction in any given sandstone. However, at least for one, the difference between red and green, by the way, is simply for all those 30 sandstones, one looks at the highest, the samples with the highest porosity at each depth. The other one's the samples with the lowest porosity at each depth. Except for this one point, we see pretty much the same scale. This is a depth where there is significant alteration. Something happened to the sandstone at that depth. The sandstone has gone through a number of diagenetic events since its deposition. And there's carbonates and other things that have been deposited in this particular sample. So then if we look at overall what we've seen for the sandstones, we see that we're getting unlike the shales, we get non-continuous distributions of the porosity with these multiple log normal-like distributions, possibly because the sandstone itself looks something like an Apollonian gasket in its structure. We see that here, unlike the shales, it's the large pores that fill first. I didn't point this out earlier, but you noticed in those scattering patterns there wasn't a big bend in them. There's no evidence in any sandstone we've looked at for mass fractal scattering. That only seems to occur in shales, carbonates. You see it sometimes in granites. Often things that have, now obviously shale is a clastic material, but in things that are more chemical precipitates, like carbonates and essentially granites, is where you tend to see these mass fractal behaviors. The origin of that remains something that we're trying to work out. We don't know. We've seen it. Other folks working on scattering in rocks have seen it. Its origin remains uncertain. We also see this change in the patterns from large scale to small scale behavior. So if you're trying to understand what's happening to the surface area properties of this rock, it depends on what scale you're looking at. Okay. Now, I'm going to change to topic 2 here. So far, everything I've been talking about is about the structure of the pores in the rocks. The next thing I want to look at least briefly, good on time, is something about the properties of those fluids that might fill those rocks. Let's get all that in there. This is data from some of my colleagues measuring the properties of confined fluids. And we don't really need to go through all of this in detail. Perhaps really what you need to see is this curve here. This shows, this is a quasi-elastic neutron scattering spectrum for water, or in this case also water with lithium chloride in it, as a function of temperature. So here's about 200 degrees. for water confined in MCM41, which is a synthetic zeolite. And what you see is, this is the height of the elastic spectrum. So the lower this is, the more quasi-elastic scattering is present. What happens as the material freezes, those motions stop, and you start to get the elastic intensity increases. So essentially what you're seeing here is the freezing point. And that's the basic point right here. About 200, 225 degrees is the freezing point of water confined in MCM41, which has about 30 nanometer pores. So, 50 degrees, ballpark, below the standard freezing point for water. Right? This shows just simply similar results in different material, SPA15. Measurements of the density of water in similar kinds of pores is what is shown here. These are normalized to those for bulk water. So as the pores get smaller, the density of the total water in that pore increases. It is not the thermodynamic properties of water inside pores when you get to the submicron region become significantly different from those of bulk water. All right? So that suggests that solubility, reaction, everything else, when you get to small pores, you need to modify your calculations to see how this is going to affect the conditions under which reactions will occur, the transport properties, everything else. Now, this is something that myself and my colleagues have been doing for a number of years. A few years ago, we asked kind of a simple question, which is, what happens if we take this to an extreme? How extreme can we make this kind of a situation? Well, there are a number of mineral phases, as well as things that occur in pores, in which we can look at water in very small channels. For instance, the barrel that I showed you a little while ago has water in those channels. Those channels are 5 angstroms across. So it's kind of the ultimate end member of confinement. Again, we have several advantages to doing this when we work on something like barrel. Barrel comes in large crystals. What that means is you can do oriented spectroscopy. You can look at motions along the channels. You can look at motions across the channels. All right? You can get quite a bit of this material fairly easily. There is a limitation to that. If you want to look at how to consider this with respect to a grain surface, in that the surface of a barrel is not a broken surface. There's not charge that isn't compensated by something else in the mineral. So you don't have these open oxygens that want to grab hydrogens, for instance, that you normally see on, say, a broken quartz surface. Okay, there are a number of materials that we can look at to do this, and these are the ones that we'll talk about somewhat later, each of which has rather different properties. In something like beryl, or cordierite, or mordenite, we tend to have water that is not really very strongly bound to the rest of the structure. It's simply sitting in that tube. One of the questions we wanted to ask to begin with is, how bound is it? Whereas in something like hemimorphite, which also has large channels, the water is bound in a plane to some of the oxygens around it. And in dioptase, we have a case where you have this big channel where the water actually makes up the end of an octahedron until you heat it. As you heat it, the dioptase changes first from green to blue, and the water appears to have just simply come loose, and we're changing the Jan-Teller distortions around that octahedron. Heat it more, the water comes out, the coppers become four-planar, and you end up with completely either water-free or very mobile water in the material. To go to blue, you have to heat it for about 400 C for a day. To go to black, you have to heat it to about 600 C. Blue and black, to this, at least so far, have never been reported as minerals. Though there is one example, we think, which I picked up a piece from the Smithsonian a month or two ago, might be the first black that has ever been found. So, I want to talk about then water in beryl. Now, what you're looking at here is inelastic neutron spectroscopy. This is essentially very similar to IR spectroscopy. If you were to take this shows, again, it's Q, it's a scale here across the bottom, and energy. Energy here is in MeV For those of you who, like me, grew up on wave numbers, if you simply multiply that by 8, you'll get the wave number. Okay. So here, this is this 450. That's the stuff around 3,500, 4,000 wave numbers for water and hydroxyl groups, the stretching motions. If you integrate all of this just to make it independent of Q, you get a spectrum very much like what you would see for an IR spectrum, except this is neutrons. Neutrons don't really see things very much like the silicon oxygen stretch at 1,000 wave numbers. They do see hydrogen things very well. So all those interferences you typically see in an IR spectrum, especially in from the metal oxygen stretching, are gone in these kinds of spectra. So you can see a lot of things much more clearly than you can see in many IR results. So Dave Wazowski calls these things shark fin diagrams. He doesn't like them very much, but actually it's a very useful way to see things because you can see both energy and space at the same time. So what you're seeing here is two IR spectra, or two INS spectra, one taken parallel to C and one taken perpendicular to C. And then we can take the difference and see what's happening. And you see a couple things in here. First, you see this pattern right here. See all the yellow? The dashed line is the recoil spectrum from a hydrogen atom. So it's a free particle, it's just free particle recoil. And what you see is this significant intensity here in the Q perpendicular orientation. So what that's telling you is that the motion of water perpendicular to the C-axis. So you remember you got this tube, but it turns out water motions are easier, they're softer, across the channel than they are along it. Right? It's much easier for water to move this way than to move along the channel, in part because water molecules are stacked, one above one another, so they're hindering each other. Right? You also see that there's a significant difference up here in that hydroxyl stretch. And we'll take a look at that in a minute here. I did leave it in there. No, I didn't. Okay. Primarily that's orientational. It has to do with differences in the orientation of the Debye-Waller factors for the water motions within the sample. Again, because you have more vibrations across the channel than you have along it. What I wanted to show you, though, was to get into some more detail. Again, here's the shark fin diagram for this on the right. You can see a number of absorbances here. Again, not much of a slope to anything here, but there is a significant Q dependence to the intensity. We'll get back to that in a minute. Look at this peak and this one here. What you're looking at is the temperature dependence of these peaks within the material. Now, typically, a vibrational peak in a spectrum like this would be expected to get more intense as temperature increases. That's simply because as temperature increases, you're making it easier to populate that higher energy level. And so you're getting more and more transitions between the two. However, if you look here, there's 5K, there's 25K, and by 80K this is gone. The same is true here. In these peaks, we show a strong decrease of the intensity of the peak with temperature. I don't think I have shown another spectrum here. No, but if we go in INS, you tend to run these spectra with different initial energies because it gives you greater detail over the range you're looking at. So the incident energy changes. When we go to lower energies, we also see that down in here, there's actually several more peaks that do the same thing. So the question is, what's going on? This shows the results of, this was done at 28 MeV and 3 MeV. And you can see this is the spectra for a hydrated barrel. And the red is one where we've simply heated it. You have to heat this stuff to 1,000 C to drive the water out of it. It's very strongly bound in the structure, though apparently not bound to it very much. You can see that all those peaks go away. So the peaks we're looking at, what this shows is that these peaks are clearly due to the water in the material. They're not from the barrel structure itself. Again, if we look parallel and perpendicular to C, you can see that most of what we're seeing here is in the Q perpendicular direction. So whatever we're happening is happening here. It's happening around the channels, not along it. Okay, again, you can see again this decrease with temperature. This shows the temperature dependence actually of a number of different peaks. We see this one here is not one of the ones that decreased with temperature, but you can see we had 7 or 8 peaks that all showed the same thing. This kind of a behavior is characteristic of 2 things. It can be either a magnetic effect or it's due to quantum tunneling. So either we have something magnetic going on in the spectrum, or what we're seeing is water tunneling between the 6 identical positions. If you think about it, in that structure that I showed you, it's hexagonal, right? Water can sit in any one of 6 positions within that structure and equally easily. So the question is, which is the origin of that? And that's easy to find out. Remember that I showed you a few minutes ago how the intensity here increases with Q. Magnetic scattering does the opposite. Magnetic scattering decreases with Q, whereas tunneling is expected to increase with Q. What we've shown in this case, well, I'll come back to one more thing. There's another way we went then to try to prove this, which was to go to deep inelastic neutron scattering. In a deep inelastic system, you're looking at very high Q. So pretty much all you're looking at is the momentum distribution of the water molecules within the sample. Right? If there is tunneling going on, you can see here's the 6-fold orientation here. You would expect an extra peak between the two. You get vibrations as the water is moving between the 2 positions, and indeed the deep inelastic very clearly showed this extra peak within the sample. It also showed, because you can get from the width of these peaks, you can get the average kinetic energy from those samples, that the kinetic energy for the water protons here, about 106 MeV, is dramatically different from that you normally get for bulk water, about 150 MeV, suggesting again that something is taking some of this kinetic energy, probably coming from the tunneling process. So what we've shown then is what's essentially a new state of water. Water in these conditions looks like a double-ended top on average, and not from vibrational motions, but from tunneling motions. So we'll have something where the hydrogens are equally distributed on average around the top and bottom of the water. There may be actually a little bit of motion of the oxygen. And so what you've done is change the symmetry of the thing. You've changed the center of gravity. And while we don't know that you've completely eliminated the dipole moment of water, we haven't completed that calculation yet, it's clear that we've tremendously altered the dipole moment of water. Again, we have a condition here, from a really extreme end, where water under confinement is dramatically different from what we expect from a bulk water molecule. Now, I've got 15 minutes left, more or less, and I'm going to try to really quickly run through the last bit of this. So, we've talked about pores. We've talked about water in the pores. How does water move in those porous materials? This is a place where neutron imaging shines. The reason is, as I said, neutrons are very penetrating, and they see hydrogens. So we can image water flow in a porous media in real time. We're currently doing these images with a time sequence of about 10 milliseconds. All right? This just shows one example of how this might be worked. This is from my friends at NIST. This shows an old-fashioned film camera and just shows the difference between a neutron image, where, for instance, you can see things that are plastic, like the film roll, very well, and you can see a lot of the details back here in the operating material of the camera, whereas in an X-ray image, you really can't see the film roll hardly at all, and you get a lot of absorbance from all of the metal. These things work great in combination. The X-ray has much higher resolution than does the neutron. Pretty much here, we're limited to maybe 15 microns at the moment for the maximum resolution, whereas some of the guys at the APS are doing 100 nanometer resolution by X-ray. They're really well used together in combination. This is just another classic example of this. This is a lead cask. with a lily in it. We tried to image that by X-ray. Superman's X-ray vision doesn't work. If he had neutron vision, he'd see the lilies quite easily. Okay, now let's see if I can get these things to work. These are movies. This was one of the earliest ones we did. This is a sandstone plate. As you can see, we can, in real time, actually this is somewhat speeded up, watch the ingress of water into this plate. I'll show you in a minute. This is quantitative. Similarly, this is an 1.5 inch diameter Berea sandstone core. And you can watch with time, I hope. There we go, as the water comes up. Water infiltrating the core. It's looking pretty much as you would expect. One of the first things we found out doing this is that if you add a fracture to the system, not just fracture along travel along the fracture, but travel around it is dramatically increased. This is in the same time scale as the one you just saw. Oh, well, it was. Let's try one more time. See how much faster? Water is actually wicking up the fracture by capillary action and then outward into the sandstone itself. So the presence of a fracture influences not only, especially in a sandstone, transport along the fracture, but in the rock around it. Don't need to show you the stuff on the left, but on the right, you can actually, I'm going to show you this one here very quickly. We can actually take that then and find the position of the front with time. And from that, I can tell you at any time the water concentration at any position or average within that, as well as the movement of the front, total uptake and flux for this material in real time. And right now we're doing this on a millisecond time scale, about 10 milliseconds. I'm trying to run through this quickly. We started worrying about fracture uptake in shales because of its effects on CO2 sequestration. Oftentimes shales are envisioned as cap rocks in these kind of environments where the sandstone below it is expected to be where the CO2 might be stored, often in with a brine solution that will react with. The question is, how good are those shales as real cap rocks? So we've been looking at uptake in 3: the Mancos Shale, the Marcellus Shale, and the Eagleford Shale. This gives you at least some idea. These things are very variable in their compositions, but in general you can describe them as a mix of carbonates, clays, and a quartz feldspar mixture. The Mancos here, the Eagleford rather, is, you can see, a very carbonate-rich shale. Mancos rather carbonate poor. We put together 2 types of samples, one with a flat fracture, I'll call it a fracture for our purposes right now, simply a cut surface, 2 rectangular blocks 6 inches long. These are 1/2 inch across. So in this case, we wanted to have a very well-constrained fracture. We wanted to know its thickness, we wanted to know its shape. On the other hand, we've also developed a system using an extrapolation of the Brazilian fracture technique where we can take a shale, or in fact I just did this with a granite on a larger scale, and make a real fracture within it. This, we'd put it in a press here and fracture it. And you can't quite see it, but there's actually a thin fracture that's broken through this sample. This is Mancos, this material here. We then wrap it. This is Kapton film, so that the outside is sealed, and then watch the capillary uptake. Now, I'm going to skip this in part, but show you a little bit of it. This is uptake in the Marcellus Shale. I'll start in a minute. And what you'll see is pretty much there's not a whole lot of permeability in the Mancos. As this goes up, this is about 3 inches. You can see this gets a little bit wider with time. But pretty much over the time scale we're looking at, in the Marcellus, things are very strongly confined to the fracture itself. However, and I'm going to skip to Eagleford for now just because of time. In the Mancos, remember this only has 1 fracture. Right? You can see all these other, this is actual water going up along grain boundaries. The main fracture's here, but those, remember the white and black layers? shale here. The bedding in this one goes this way. The bedding here goes across, so you wouldn't expect any of that within these two. Now, if we went, however, to real Brazilian fractures, the Marcellus again looks pretty similar to what you've seen before. You'll see that it comes up and then it hits a bunch of anastomosing fractures in the middle of the sample, so everything kind of slows down. But pretty much things are, and again now here bedding is in this direction. Pretty much things are pretty well confined to the fracture. However, look at the mancos. Only one fracture in this sample. All the rest of this is either water that is coming up along bedding or water that's diffusing outward into the sample. In the mancos, you would expect a great deal more reaction between the bulk rock and whatever is being transported, that water CO2 fluid, than you will in the Marcellus, which suggests that the Marcellus actually would probably make a much better cap rock for a CO2 sequestration environment than would the mancos. Much more reaction, much more permeability in what appears to be a fairly solid shale. I'm not going to go through this. We can go ahead and actually quantify that uptake rate. This shows uptake rates for those three materials as a function of time. As you can see again, there's also a great deal. Try again. There we go. Great deal of difference in just the capillary uptake rates between these samples. There is interaction. These are not just plain. If you try to model these things as simply flat plates with no reaction between the shale and the fluid, you're not going to reproduce what you see. There's an interaction here between the solid material and the fluid that's coming up. However, changing the fluid composition, in this case we didn't have these at temperature, so our approximation of CO2 was to saturate the rock with the fluid with bicarbonate, and you can see it made very little difference to the rates here. There's a big difference between the Marcellus and the Eagle Bird, but essentially no difference that we can measure between pure water and bicarbonate saturated water. I've got data for sodium chloride saturated water and for slick water as well that there's no time to show here. However, this is one thing that is important. The theory of capillary uptake, or flat plate between two plates, would suggest this should be, it's a diffusion process. It should be linear as a function of the square root of time. And if you saw these before, obviously this is plotted as a square root of time. You can see that it is not linear as a function of square root of time. In fact, it's something close to, but not exactly, a logarithmic behavior. This is, again, probably because of this interaction between the shale and the uptake. This is known as anomalous diffusion or anomalous capillary flow. We're currently in the process now of trying to model this and try to understand what's happening at that surface that's actually controlling. It's not just wetting behavior, because wetting behavior is already taken into account here, unless the wetting behavior is changing as a function of time. So, really quickly, skip that. I wanted to show you this as a last slide. Dave Cole and I obtained this data just a couple of weeks ago. And what we wanted to do was to look at how wormholes form in real rocks. Now there's a lot of work, modeling work out there, trying to understand this kind of a process. And in wormhole formation, you've got a reaction that's happening quickly at rather fast flow rates. And what happens is you get a positive feedback loop, and the dissolution will essentially drill its way right through the rock. It happens because you get more flow where dissolution is already occurring. This has been modeled by lots of people, Tony Ladd, Carl Stiefel, others have worked on this for a number of years. But in all of those cases, they've done that assuming this kind of homogeneous matrix. In fact, the original work that was done on this, where they did it experimentally, they did it in plaster, because it was the finest, most homogeneous material we could work on. This is a real limestone. And what we found, this is hydrochloric acid reacting with a limestone. Look here. By frame 15, you're already seeing this wormhole present. And instead of drilling its way, in fact, the hydration front has already gone through. It went through within the first couple minutes. Instead of drilling its way through, What's happening is the acid is moving along grain boundaries and forming an original path. If you try to model this material as a continuum, you will not reproduce what's really seen in the real rock, because the grain boundary flow paths are what is really controlling how all this reaction occurs. And without that, the model can't reproduce dissolution in real materials. As I said, this is really new data, and we'll just leave it at that. So, several conclusions. I think I've covered most of these already, and finished it in less than an hour at least. It was pretty good. Thank you all for your attention.
Right, thanks.
Questions?
So yeah, we can take a few questions. Connell?
So I was wondering if you could make a connection between the first part of your talk and the second part. Can you go from your measurements to the fractal patterns of porosity to the permeability of the rocks that you're talking?
If you happen to look in EOS and various places like that, you will have seen recently that ORNL is currently looking to hire somebody in multi-scale modeling. This is a core thing that our group, that some of the other groups at the lab as well, some of the people who work on, say, particle bed reactors, desperately need. We really want to make that connection because we can quantify the pore structure. We can quantify how it's changing. We can look at how the fluids are moving through it. But go back to this one here. Think about modeling that. You have to start out with something which has, fast flow paths that are very thin around grains where the diffusion rate is very slow. What that means is if you try to do it with like a standard finite element model, you've got a lot of points. Right? So instead you have to have some kind of a flexible, an adjustable grid model where you can have a lot of detail in certain places and not a lot in others. So the answer to your question is, heck yes, we want to do that. No, we haven't done it yet.
So this would be
You're interested?
No. My modeling skills aren't that good. But it seems to me this would be a very difficult problem. But the simpler problem would be when you're just looking at the uptake of your sandstones with water without the cracks and things.
Yeah, that you can probably model as a continuum and see how it's changing. If the bulk is changing, there's no obvious paths. But even there, remember when I was talking about how those things fell, right? We think that it's not really precipitating evenly within the material. Precipitation seems to occur in sandstones in these larger pore channels, and we don't know whether that's because of the thermodynamics or if it's because of the flow. And to do that, you have to have a model where you have easier flow paths, faster flow paths, greater volume paths, and some without that. So the answer is, heck yes, we're working on that, but no, we're not there yet.
Any other questions? I have a question. So I was intrigued by, I was really intrigued by the quantum tunneling. That's really cool. But I was also intrigued by this observation that the larger pores are getting smoother as you compact it, while the smaller ones are getting rougher. And I wondered, so that means there's some magical size there. There's some boundary between those two behaviors, some size where the roughness is staying about constant. Is that size boundary different from sample to sample, or the same from sample to sample?
Yet.
Or is it maybe telling us something fundamental
it's
about the
structure? It's unknown yet, but there is a great deal of modeling in the metallurgical literature about what's called the roughening transition. And as you get, it's a function of size and a function of temperature. Materials, you think they smooth with temperature, but as you get to higher temperatures, entropy becomes dominant. And so, especially at smaller sizes, what will happen is at higher temperatures, materials won't smooth, they'll get rougher. And it's well known in metallurgy because it's used to make things stronger, because you make those boundaries rougher and the grains actually adhere better to one another.
Mm-hmm. But that's like a temperature.
It's temperature, but it's also scale dependent.
But it's also scale dependent. Huh.
Yeah. That's, like I said, there's been modeling of this. I can't remember the guy's name. His Russian name starts with a V. As a transfer of entropy from larger scales to smaller scales.
Right. Any other questions?
I'm just going to throw out that I've often advocated this neutron. They call it radiography, I guess you call it.
This would be radiography. We've done tomography also. Yeah.
So yeah, it's really one of the best ways of, it seems like kind of heavy duty approach, but sometimes you really would like to know how much water you have. And this is about the most powerful way I know.
Depending on what you want to do it, there's several ways to do it. There's actually ways just to bulk analyze water materials. It's often more accurate than TGA.
Exactly.
And it's really good. And especially if all you want to do is to get the bulk water material, the guys at NIST will take that and do that analysis for you. You don't even have to go over there, just give them the sample. Because that doesn't take long. It's called prompt gamma analysis.
Do you usually use protons, or do you also use deuterons? Because I'm talking,
It depends.
There's a big scattering difference between the two.
It depends what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
So, for instance, for this, it's protons, it's water, because we want that extra contrast. One of the things you can do here is, the real question when you look at a porous material, okay, great, I can tell you how much porosity is in there. How much of that's actually connected? How much of it's sealed? Turns out, the scattering intensity is a function of what's called the scattering length density. And for quartz, that's about 4.2 times 10 to the minus 6 inverse angstrom squared. The scattering length density for water is negative. It's negative about 0.58. For D2O, it's 0.63. So what you can do is, let's say you have a sandstone, simplest case. You can then take H2O and D2O and mix them to have a 4.2 scattering length density, soak the rock in. Now make your measurement. Make it before, make it after. The scattering after you've made it is any pore that's not connected. Any pore that is won't scatter because there's no scattering length density contrast across the boundary. So you can take a look at your porosity and separate connected versus unconnected porosity that way. We just synthesized, I had the idea, a friend of mine who's an actual organic chemist did the work, made a deuterated epoxy. The reason for that is that hydrogen has a big incoherent scattering, which in a lot of things tends to be a background. By making a deuterated epoxy, we can take, say, small, if we want to do single crystal diffraction, usually you'll glue the sample onto some kind of a needle, something like that, to do that. If you do that with deuterated epoxy, if the epoxy gets in the way, you don't have all that background scattering. So it was something we've done recently for that kind of work. So it depends on the experiments we're doing. Some you want that extra scattering, some you're trying to get rid of it. With the confined water stuff, one of the things we're trying to play around with now is we'd like to take the barrel, dehydrate it, and then perhaps put it in our internally heated, pressurize it, and replace the water with, say, methane. And then we can look at methane under those conditions.
All right, so just let everyone know you're welcome to join us for lunch in another 15-20 minutes here. And if you want, a what?
Could be now.
Well, yeah, I guess it could be now as well. Yeah, so stay if you want to have lunch, and if you're interested in meeting with Larry later today, we can probably work that in as well. So just talk to me about that. So we'll thank Larry again.
I was talking to Bruce Watson, and he did all that study of the wetting angles and function of pressure, temperature, and I was telling him, I said, at one point we were discussing what is basically the effective flow that you can get on the self-diffusion. And so I what else do you do exactly that? What you suggest is start out your system with H2O, and then basically start to switch the system, and you either start with D2O and switch to H2O or vice versa, and watch that
gradient forming, between the two.
You should be able to detect that brilliantly.
Because it seems clear that the fluid is affecting the stuff it's flowing through, and it's probably changing the wetting angle with time.
It's exactly right.
Can I pull this thing out, or?
Yeah, I think
Is
so.
it
Yeah,
loose?
I don't know if we need to. Oh, check.
In Mac, you don't necessarily have to, but it's often better.
Yeah, you can pull it out. I'll give them away.
Yeah, I didn't know in my computer.
I don't see anything in there, so, oh, there it is, there, no name. Just drag that down to the trash. Down here. Probably down there. There it is. Yeah, it's a little arrow. Drag it to the arrow. Good. It stopped doing its thing. I can pull it. Very good.